The cannon in Clash Royale can be forgettable compared to other buildings. It's not a giant building, a building that can melt units, and doesn't even really have any cool abilities. A cannon is as basic as it gets when it comes to defense. You put it down, it sits there, and fires at units when they get close. No fancy abilities, just straight damage. It doesn't sound too interesting, but it's had a roller coaster of a history, and its existence has been very important for the shaping of the meta, appearing in some very iconic decks. So today, we're going to go over the cannon's entire history, the decks it's appeared in, the balance changes it's received, and how it ended up in the position it's in today. Cannon has been in the game since day 1 of beta on January 4th, 2016, and pretty quickly it was obvious that it was the worst defensive building. When doing some comparisons, it was very apparent why. Let's break it down. Compared to a Tesla, it cost 2 more elixir, had a slower hit speed, and dealt the same damage per attack, so it had a lower damage per second. But it had 1 more tile of range and a lot more hit points, and they both had a 60-second lifetime. Tesla could also attack air units, which Cannon couldn't do. Not to even mention, Tesla had the ability to hide from all danger when it wasn't active in combat, while Cannon had no ability. Obviously, it was a common, so you wouldn't really expect it to have an ability, but Tesla was common too, so it didn't seem fair. Looking at the first set of available stats from January, it was no surprise to see Cannon as only one of 5 cards to see absolutely no top ladder play. There was no situation or justification to use this over one of the other buildings. 6 elixir for a dedicated defense building with no special ability with stats comparable to a card much cheaper than it? Seriously, what was Supercell thinking? Anyone could have seen this was going to be one of the, if not the worst card in the game from the start. It was so bad and underused, I could barely find any gameplay of the card during this era. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is that before beta, buildings didn't have a lifetime stat like they do now. So if you consider this in mind with Cannon, it makes a bit more sense. It just wasn't properly rebalanced. But what doesn't make sense is that the other buildings were supposed to be this way too, and most didn't suffer as bad as Cannon. Seth, a former community manager, commented on this.
Cannon was the worst card in the game before. The first month of the game, it was the worst card. Literally, I don't think I saw one. I played it in a friendly battle just to see what the model looked like.
So, less than a month into the game's beta, it was changed, and this would be one of the biggest reworks a card has ever received. The biggest, most notable change being its elixir cost being reduced from 6 to 3. No other card's elixir cost has ever been changed by 3. Plenty have had it changed by 1, and the heal spell got its cost reduced by 2, but changing it by 3 just makes it completely different. It went from being the most expensive dedicated defensive building to the cheapest. Just 1 elixir can make a bottom tier card a top tier and vice versa. There was no telling how much of an impact a 3 elixir reduction would make, but at least Supercell knew this well enough to not let Cannon go without some compensation. At the cost of this cost reduction, Cannon lost 1 tile of range, meaning it now had the same range as a Tesla, which allowed the Musketeer to outrange it. Its lifetime was also reduced by 20 seconds, or 33%, and its hit points were reduced by 55%. To put this into perspective, a level 9 cannon post-rework had fewer hit points than a level 1 cannon pre-rework. Supercell wanted to promote an offensive environment, and Cannon not being able to attack towers and having so many hit points and being so expensive was not facilitating this. Cannon didn't have a special ability, so making it cheat would help it find its place, and just be viable without making the meta too defensive overall. After the rework went live, we started to see its rates trickle up. It had about a 10% use rate in top ladder by the end of February, which is okay, but not great for the time. It was good for countering things like Hog Rider for a positive elixir trade, but cards like Inferno Tower and even the Elixir Pump were just more useful defensive buildings at the time. Cannon was used really only in decks that already had multiple buildings, usually as a block for the more valuable ones. But despite this, Supercell would decide to nerf it again in the next set of balance changes. On March 23, 2016, Cannon would receive a nerf. In this set, its lifetime would be decreased from 40 to 30 seconds. This change was not very well received. Hog Rider was considered to be a very obnoxious win condition of which Cannon was great against, so many thought that a nerf to Cannon would lead to Hog Riders running rampant. Especially with it not being overused in competitive play, the nerf seems uncalled for, but when you look at the greater picture, it makes sense. Cannon was overshadowed by other defensive buildings, mostly Tesla, and Tesla was also getting nerfed in that set of changes, which would make Cannon better by comparison. So in a way, this was preemptive. It may have still seemed a bit hasty, but Supercell was biased against defense-heavy cards, so they wanted it to be a little on the weaker side. In retrospect, however, this nerf didn't seem to go far enough. You see, Hog Rider decks didn't really benefit from a cannon nerf, it was actually the opposite. A lot of Hog decks were very offensive and relied on the cannon alone for defense. The lifetime decrease didn't make a huge difference because cannon got the majority of its value in just a few seconds. It continued to be used a healthy amount in April, with its use rate actually trickling up through the month. It was making the meta annoyingly defensive, so in the next set of balance changes on May 3rd, Supercell took action once again, decreasing its hit points by 11%. This is obviously a good nerf, but because of another thing that happened in the same update, this nerf had a much smaller effect on the card than you'd expect. You see, also in this update, a new level was added for commons and rares, which meant they all essentially got an extra 10% of health and damage at the max level. So compared to any epic or legendary card, Cannon lost basically no hit points, and it was dealing a lot more damage now. A max level cannon before the update had 1264 hit points, but now a max level cannon had 1236, which is only about a 2% decrease. And when you consider that the other more popular defensive buildings received very harsh nerfs, it's no surprise that Cannon was still incredibly popular after this change going live. Royal Giant also received a buff in this patch, making it very prominent, and Cannon was decent in combination with some other cards in taking them down. Because of all this, it quickly rose to becoming the second most used card in Top Ladder. So, just 15 days after the last change, Cannon would be changed again. On May 18th, its hit points would be reduced by another 5%, but this did basically nothing as Cannon was still the second most popular card in Top Ladder with a 60% use rate, significantly higher than all of the other defensive buildings combined. You saw it in all different kinds of decks, but the one I really want to highlight is called Hog Trifecta. Cannon has had a place in quite a few iconic Hog Rider decks, and this was really the first one. Hog Trifecta was incredibly popular, and Cannon, even after all the nerfs it got, was still an excellent defense for just 3 elixir that allowed the user to make the rest of the deck very offensive. The card was as popular as ever. People had been realizing the power of this card more and more as time went on, and with the nerf to the other defensive buildings, it was sneaking its way to the top, as the hit point nerfs really didn't do much at all. So, on June 21st, it would be given yet another nerf. And once again, they would nerf its hit points, this time by 8%. The game had only existed for 6 months, and this was its 5th balance change. They weren't trying anything differently. For the 3rd time in a row, Cannon was getting its health reduced. It did practically nothing the first 2 times, but certainly 3rd time's the charm. Following the next few months after this nerf, Cannon's rates were trickling down. You had seen Cannon in Heavy Beatdown, Control, and Cycle decks before, but after the last nerf, you were really only seeing it in Cycle. More specifically, Hog and Miner decks. You had to protect the Cannon a bit more to get value out of it, so decks that relied on Cannon to take care of things on its own weren't as viable anymore. Although Miner and Hog weren't going anywhere, these decks would evolve over time to no longer include Cannon. Its rates continued to trickle for a while until October, where its usage hit the lowest it's been since the Cannon became 3 elixir. One reason for the Cannon's fall during this era was due to the rise in prominence of Tombstone. Tombstone was a 3 elixir defensive spawner building, and it was very strong after some buffs, and given that it was so cheap, it was creeping into Cannon's territory. Cannon's value came from its cheapness, so even though Tombstone wasn't as close to Cannon as something like Tesla or Bomb Tower, Tombstone was close enough because a lot of these decks were just looking for something cheap that could attract Hogs and Giants. It wouldn't be until Tombstone getting nerfed at the end of November where Cannon's usage spiked up to a healthier range, but Miner wasn't really using it anymore. It was really only seen with Hog Rider now. You were occasionally seeing it with other win conditions like Expo or Graveyard, but Hog was consistently its main cut. It ended off the year having about an average use rate. It had gotten 0 balance changes in the second half of 2016, and we had seen the card fluctuate so much in that period. Its future was definitely up in the air. It seemed like it could have crept up again, or just died out completely. There was no consistency in its performance. Things seemed to be okay in the first couple months of 2017, but by April it had another massive drop-off. This time, Cannon was being widely replaced by Tornado, a 3 elixir spell that pulled and kept units in place. This card was excellent defensively, and could activate the King Tower to act as a defense. With Tornado, you didn't even need a building, as you could just hold units in the center for 3 seconds and let all 3 towers deal with them. Hog decks, which had been the last bastion for Cannon, were now widely using Tornado, leaving Cannon without a place. By June, not even a single top ladder player was using it. It seemed to be over. With so many other amazing options, Cannon would need a major buff to make a comeback. Just when it seemed to be down for good though, it had a small spike in July 2017 due to the rise of bridge spam. Cards like Battle Ram resisted the tornado's pull better than most cards, so it wasn't as effective. Having that cheap building to pull and absorb the ram was more valuable to have in this meta, although this was just a brief spike due to a chaotic meta, as the following month it fell right back down. And that's pretty much the sum of 2017. Kind of a dull, uneventful year where Cannon pretty consistently had near zero usage in competitive play. Yet, despite this, Supercell wasn't budging with a buff. Luckily though, 2018 wouldn't be as sad as 2017 despite the card going another full year with no balance changes. Hog 2.6, a very iconic Hog Rider deck which had been around since 2017, was really starting to take off. Cannon was still underused overall, but it had a place, and considering Supercell didn't really like defensive buildings, they seemed to be content with that. Also, even though Hog 2.6 wasn't dominating the game or anything, it was becoming very common and a bit hated, so buffing that deck to be more defensive would have likely led to a lot of backlash. Hog 2.6 wasn't just a popular Hog Rider deck, it was the Hog Rider deck, and it was the epitome of what made Hog Rider, a card that has been complained about for as long as the game has existed, so annoying. And this was a rough position to be in because statistically overall, Cannon was underused and not performing too well outside of that one deck. Even this deck consistently had a win rate below 50% because it was widely used and not so easy to play. Tesla got a rework in late 2017 and it had become the widespread building of choice, leaving Cannon as Hog Cycle fodder. If Hog 2.6 wasn't so prevalent in this period, Cannon would have likely seen no play whatsoever and gotten a buff, but this deck was keeping it just good enough for Supercell to not want to buff it. There just wasn't much actively going on whatsoever with defensive buildings. Players seemed to all agree that a big problem with Cannon was that it was simply too fragile. It died so quickly, so an HP buff seemed like the best way to bring it back. Hog 2.6 worked with Cannon because cards like Ice Golem, Ice Spirit, and Skeletons could be used to distract units from the cannon, giving it more time to blast away. It needed specific support like this for it to be viable. But Supercell did not like giving extra hit points to buildings. Not to say they never did it, but giving hit points to a building just makes it more defensive. So many buildings today have way fewer hit points than they did back in 2016 because the game simply isn't as fun when buildings have too many hit points, even if they're statistically balanced. But although a small buff to Cannon could help it see some play in other decks, anything more could make 2.6 even more of a nightmare to deal with. The year ended off with Cannon having an abhorrent use with not even close to a decent win rate. Going into 2019, Hog 2.6 was the most used deck in Clash Royale, but Cannon itself was still underrepresented as it could just not work in anything else. It was pretty consistently the #1 most used deck. This was a very awkward position to be in. How can a card be present in the most used deck in the game, yet feel so bad for years on end? It just felt like at this point, it was Cannon's destiny. There was no urgency to make the card more prevalent than it already was, but just when it was seeming like nothing would change, Cannon appeared in the July balance changes, the first time it's been present in over 3 years. In this set of changes, Cannon's damage would be increased by a whopping 32%, but both its hit speed and first hit attack time would be increased by 0.2 of a second. So what was the thought process behind this rework? Well, it had to do with another card that I haven't mentioned yet, the Cannon cart. This card had been in the game for a while, but I didn't feel it was necessary to mention until now because it was so different from Cannon. Cannon Cart wasn't even a building, and it cost 2 more elixir. But the idea behind Cannon Cart was that it was a cannon on wheels, and their stats varied in so many different ways that they didn't really feel similar at all. So the main goal of this balance update was to make them more consistent with one another while also buffing them. Now Cannon and Cannon Cart would have the same hit speed and damage, and now Cannon could one-shot goblins and would deal about 5% more damage per second. This rework would make the card better against bigger units and goblins, but it would be worse against fragiler units that were already one-shot by it like skeletons and spear goblins, or stuff like archers, a unit that Cannon took 2 shots to take out before and after this rework. Overall, there were a lot of disadvantages that made this rework not seem like so much of a buff as it was intended. The damage buff was nice certainly, but it just attacked so much slower now. Comparing the rates from before and after the change, there was basically no difference. But if anything, the rates were a little worse, as its win rate was dipping in the low 30s now. This rework didn't change Cannon's place in the meta whatsoever. It was still only being used in Hog 2.6, and you weren't seeing it in any new one. 2019 continued to be a sad year for the card, with no more developments or changes to note, and even at one point in December, its win rate in challenges dropped to below 25%. At this point, it seemed clear that the rework overall was a negative for the card. All it really did was make it more consistent with the cannon card. People didn't really see cannon as being as bad as it truly was though, because they were playing against 2.6 regularly, which meant they were seeing cannon, and since the deck performed well, people saw no reason for this annoying card to be buffed. Going into 2020, cannon was still by far the least used of the main defensive buildings, so only a few months into the year, on March 3rd, cannon would appear in the balance changes once again. This time, its damage was being straight up increased by 5%, which didn't really have any major interaction changes, but it would make it better at whittling down bigger units. This seems to make no difference whatsoever in its performance. Cannon Cart was doing just fine, but for the 4th year in a row, Cannon was still only appearing in Hog 2.6, and 2.6 consistently remained a top deck. There wouldn't be another development until June 2021, where Cannon would receive yet another balance change. The Cannon cart had been decent for a while, but had fallen in recent months, so since both cards were underused again, they decided it was time to buff them again. In this set, its hit speed was decreased by 1/10 of a second, and its first hit attack time was decreased by 1/10 of a second. Cannon had needed major buffs for years at this point, but it seemed like it was only ever buffed when the Cannon cart had a falling out. This card was essentially blocking Cannon from getting the proper buffs it needed. A hit speed decrease isn't nothing, of course, but just a 1/10 decrease usually doesn't make too much of an impact. And it seemed that would be the case here, as comparing rates before and after the change, there was basically no change again. It was so strange to see Cannon in this one-of-a-kind position for so long. Hog 2.6 was a one-of-a-kind deck, surviving through countless metas, being the only thing keeping Cannon even remotely relevant, and Cannon Cart was making it harder to balance since they were forced to share some of the same stats. A simple health buff probably could have brought Cannon right back, but that likely wouldn't happen simply because of 2.6. Personally, I think other cards like Fireball, Log, and Skeletons were too strong, and Cannon being weak sort of balanced out the deck, so the proper move would have been to nerf some of these other cards in 2.6, then buff the Cannon. But these were spells and cheap units, which are the types of cards Supercell let be overused on purpose. The June 2016 nerf had done irreparable damage to this card that, even 5 years later, was never truly able to recover from. And this damage really was unrecognized because of the prominence of Hog 2.6. Most people didn't think of Cannon as being a bottom-tier card. Cannon's history up to this point has not been particularly interesting. It had a few developments in 2016, but since then it's pretty much just been present in Hog 2.6 while getting a few balance changes that did absolutely nothing. But just a few months after this most recent balance change, everything was about to change. Cannon had been an underdog card for a while that really didn't seem like it had a lot of potential. It got its yearly buff, but at the end of the day, they were limiting the love they gave to it because of its defensive nature and as to not overbuff the Cannon card. However, in October 2021, we would see a major meta shift that would change Clash Royale forever. This would be the introduction of Champions, a new rarity of card that had the unique attribute of only one of them being able to be on the field at once per user. This allowed you to cycle through your deck significantly faster when a champion was on the field, and it was the spark of a whole new era for Cycle. Now, you wouldn't really expect this to matter much in regards to Cannon, because Cycle has had plenty of development for years that didn't seem to make any difference for Cannon, but this time it was different. Almost immediately, you started to see champions leading to new developments for Cannon, as in October you saw this Archer Queen replacing Musketeer in 2.6. Even though it cost 1 more elixir than Musketeer, thus raising the cost of a deck that was supposed to be very cheap, the fact that you wouldn't have to cycle to it again until the Queen died let you get to all the other cards much quicker. We hadn't really seen substitutions for Hog 2.6 before, but with Champions, we were finally seeing the turn of the tide. But this alone wasn't convincing enough to prove that Cannon was on the verge of a major comeback. Archer Queen was very overpowered during this time, and even when this deck was popular, Cannon's rates were still low. But, as I said, this was just the spark. There was a popular Royal Hogs Archer Queen deck going around during this period too, but Goblin Cage, which was very popular in it, got a major nerf in December, and following that change, you started to see some people actually sub in the Cannon for it. We hadn't seen Cannon in a top deck that wasn't 2.6 in years, so this was pretty massive. This deck trickled up in popularity in the following months, and in February, it was the second most used deck in the game, behind only Hog 2.6, meaning Cannon was now in the top 2 most popular decks. This was a massive development for the card and showed that maybe the Cannon would have a promising future after all. Its use and win rate had a major rise to rates that were slightly below average, but still healthy. But the developments for 2022 were far from over. You saw a new variant of Hog Cycle blowing up around March, but the majority of decks rising around this time had a champion in them. In the next few months, the Mighty Miner was released, and you saw some decks with him popping up with the cannon. There was a Mighty Miner log bait deck that used cannon over Inferno Tower and Tesla, which was very unusual because those buildings had always been the choice in that archetype. It wasn't thought to be able to work because without one of those other buildings, there wasn't really a strong, reliable defense against air units. But with the amount of cannons you could cycle to lure air units and princesses to deal some air damage thanks to 3-card cycle, it was able to work. Another Mighty Miner deck that included cannon was this one with the Goblin Drill and Wall Breakers, having even less air defense than the log bait one. With 2 buildings and 3-card cycle, you could always have one on the field, making it very hard for things to break through. These cycle decks were faster than any other decks we've seen in Clash Royale history, and just wouldn't have worked the same with something like Tesla. Also in this era, we saw the rise of a giant skeleton Hog Rider deck with the Queen. Electro Giant was buffed in June, and this led to it becoming very popular. Cannon was very good against it because not only was Electro Giant building targeting, but it was immune to Tornado, which was a major Electro Giant synergizer. This Electro Giant deck blew up in the summer of 2022, allowing Cannon to thrive even further. Thanks to this deck, Archer Queen Hog Cycle, Mighty Miner Cycle, and for the players that still refuse to play anything other than 2.6, Cannon rose to being in over 20% of Grand Challenge decks. It was the most used building by this point, and you were really starting to see players get frustrated at this card. It was really good in these champion-oriented decks, and despite all the nerfs all of them would have gotten, that 3-card cycle mechanic was set in stone since the introduction of champions, which gave Cannon this continuous opportunity to adapt into this new meta. Even after harsh nerfs to Golden Knight and Electro Giant in August, Cannon continued to have very high usage. Giant Skeleton was blowing up in popularity, and it was being used with Hog Rider and Cannon a lot. Supercell was hesitant about nerfing Cannon since its rise seemed so random after years of suffering at the bottom, but despite all the indirect nerfs it was getting, it was remaining as the most used building. Supercell eventually realized that 3-card cycle was going to keep the cannon in this strong state, and indirect nerfs would likely not tone it down, as its usage had only been trickling up since champions were added, so in the next set of balance changes, Cannon would finally receive a nerf. Nerfing Cannon almost seemed like a ridiculous notion. It had unviable rates in the exact state it was in a year ago. But the meta had permanently shifted, and it had stood the test of time in numerous metas, so it was time to give the other buildings a turn again. In October 2022, Supercell would decrease the cannon's hit points by 8% again. The exact change that left it basically to rot for so many years. Cannon has lost so many hit points since its release, and it seems crazy to make it even more fragile than it already was since that's what its weakness was for many years. But with the support of the Champions mechanic, it needed some form of toning down. In Grand Challenges, 78% of all decks played with Cannon also had a champion in it, and the win rate of Cannon decks with a champion were 50%, whereas Cannon decks without a champion had a win rate of 40%. This directly shows the effect champions had on Cannon. I just want to compare numbers for a minute. A level 1 Cannon in January 2016 had 1,000 hit points, and one after all the nerfs now had 322 hit points. About a 68% decrease from its original form. Originally, Cannon had about the same hit points as a Boss Bandit, but after this most recent nerf, it had about the same health as a Royal Hog. But even after this further nerf to its hit points, it still had alright rates. It was mostly just appearing with Hog Rider again, but at least it was more than just 2.6, and there was even a popular miner deck gaining a decent amount of traction. Overall, it still seemed to be in a very good position. But this wouldn't last long, as later in the month, the Phoenix and Monk would be added, which would be very unfavorable additions for Cannon. The Phoenix was a very popular air card, and because Cannon couldn't attack air, it wasn't doing too well in a Phoenix-dominated environment. And the Monk could reflect projectiles, so against Cannon, the Monk could simply be sent in the front, then use its ability to reflect the cannon shots, removing it very quickly. For the month of November, Cannon wasn't really viable again, having a very low use and win rate. But once Phoenix and Monk were toned down more in December, you saw a bounce back. Mighty Miner was back and stronger than ever, so you were seeing a lot more Mighty Miner bait and cycle again. By the end of the year, it had a well above average use rate and a decent win rate, so the nerf had clearly not killed it. In fact, it seems like it may have needed another nerf at some point in the future. Going into 2023, you were seeing a lot of Cannon with Electro Giant. It was still quite popular despite the nerf it got. This deck was very popular in the early months of 2023, at one point being the most popular deck. In February, it made up 3% of all decks played in the game. With all the Electro Giant cycle, Hog decks, Royal Hog cycle, Miner cycle, and Mighty Miner bait going around, Cannon was able to easily stay the most popular building. Hell, even some Expo players were subbing out Tesla for it. But you did start to see a trickle down throughout the year. This Electro Giant deck that was Canon's most popular deck got heavily nerfed, which didn't straight up kill Electro Giant decks, but definitely weakened them. But that's okay, because you still saw a good amount of Cannon and Mighty Miner decks, until that got nerfed in June 2023. Bomb Tower was creeping up around this time, so you were seeing a lot of Hog decks using this building instead of Cannon, which are the decks you also saw Mighty Miner common in. It wasn't just seeing play in Hog 2.6, nor was its rates the worst they've ever been, but it was seeming like Cannon wasn't too viable in this meta. But in October, Bomb Tower was nerfed, and in November they added the Little Prince. With a fresh new champion to spice things up, 3-card Cycle was back in the meta, practically bigger than ever considering it was the cheapest champion. You saw a lot of new popular Cannon decks rising with this champion, and subsequently saw Cannon's rates rise back up again. By the end of 2023, Cannon was sitting in a great spot. But the question was whether or not Cannon could cling on to relevancy once the Little Prince was inevitably nerfed. 2024 would kick off with an Archer Queen buff, helping this Royal Hogs deck quite a bit. January was pretty much still the same, with Cannon appearing in champion-oriented decks, but things would shift in February. With the addition of the second evolution slot, Cannon struggled to thrive, leading to a downtick in performance. Cannon was having a tough time dealing with the influx of evolutions. You did see Hog 2.6 with the evolved Ice Spirit and Skeletons, but they were far from the best evolutions, and 2.6 certainly wasn't in the best state in general. In March, they added the Tesla Evolution, which was the first of the defensive buildings to get an evolution, which gave a significant advantage to it over Cannon. Over the next few months, it ruled the game, overshadowing all the other defensive buildings, leading to Cannon's rates plummeting to the worst they've been since before champions were released. On top of Tesla being a significantly better defensive building, the Dagger Duchess was a new tower troop also very prevalent during this period, and with her, you didn't really need to have as much defense in your deck anymore in general. This was just about the worst environment for Cannon ever. This period lasted from about March to June. Quite a long period with little to no Cannon in the meta. When only certain cards get evolutions, it's unfair to similar cards in its category that don't get one. But since there were very few cards that had evolutions, and they were only adding 1 to 2 a month, there was no telling when Cannon would get one and get to compete on the same level as Tesla again. Luckily though, in July, both Tesla and Dagger Duchess would receive major nerfs, allowing Cannon to sprout once again. For the next few months, things were pretty standard. You saw Cannon in 2.6 and Archer Queen Hog Cycle. Hog Cycle with the Queen was increasing in popularity steadily because the evolved Skeletons and Ice Spirit made the deck so much stronger, and they were dodging nerfs. And 3-card Cycle let you play the evolutions really fast. Speaking of 3-card Cycle, history would repeat itself once again in October. This month, Goblinstein would be introduced as yet another overpowered champion. Like with the Little Prince, after its release, it was everywhere and ushered in a new era for Cannon decks. There were a countless amount of Goblinstein decks surging in the meta with various win conditions in October, and a lot of them were including Cannon. About a quarter of Grand Challenge decks were including this building, putting it at the highest usage it's had in years. Cannon may have been suffering earlier in the year, but this era proved the card could be very deadly. When cards are released overpowered, Mirror can become very powerful as well, but since champions couldn't be mirrored, overpowered champions didn't raise its use rate, so Cannon was basically the mirror for champions in a way. So right when Cannon was at its peak in ages, Supercell ultimately decided it was the best time to add an evolution for it. That's right, in November 2024, Cannon would become the second defensive building to get an evolution, meaning it would be getting a brand new ability. Cannon has always been a very basic building. It never really had any ability or anything that made it really stand out, so what could they possibly do to this 9-year-old card to freshen it up? Well, to nobody's expectation, this card would be getting an Enter the Arena ability. When placed, 9 projectiles would be summoned from the sky, raining down beside and in front of the building, dealing damage and knockback to anything within its radius. It would deal 1 tile of knockback to any knockback vulnerable unit, which is the same as a fireball, and the damage each projectile would do would be 34% higher than the normal cannon projectile, so it could one-shot units like princesses and firecrackers. After this initial rain though, it would function exactly like a normal cannon. There were no stat buffs. Players were confused at this evolution because it was just such a random ability. You could have added an ability like this to just about any building, and Cannon didn't even seem like the top building that would get an ability like this. It was compared to the Eagle Artillery from Clash of Clans. If anything was going to come from Clash of Clans, people assumed it would have been the double cannon. Weird ability aside, this was just underwhelming in general. The ability was only useful in certain situations, and sometimes you might not even hit your target and just hit nothing. If you miss that initial rain, there's literally nothing that makes it better than a normal cannon. But giving an evolution, no matter how underwhelming, would not hurt an already overused card. So how would this affect things going forward? Pretty early on, it was obvious that Cannon did not have a good evolution. It was very underused, having a 1 to 2% use rate with a far below average win rate. It was just not worth using an evolution slot for. However, Goblinstein was still very popular in November despite receiving a nerf, so Cannon was still overall used in about 30% of decks. The evolution had barely been acknowledged though. It was a weird situation because the evolution clearly needed a buff, but the base card was so overused that we didn't really need any more Cannon by buffing its evolution. Although Goblinstein was responsible for the massive upsurge, so Cannon would settle down once it received a proper nerf. But it didn't receive one in 2024, so Cannon ended the year being in about 1/4 of Grand Challenge decks. The January balance changes would finally give Goblinstein a proper nerf, knocking it down significantly, but in the same set of changes, the evolved Cannon's barrage projectiles would receive a 10% increase to their damage, which now meant it could one-shot bombers and wall breakers. It doesn't sound too significant, but following the changes going live, evolved Cannon saw a major spike in usage rate, whereas base Cannon saw a decline. Overall, there was still a lot of Cannon being played in January, but not quite as much as in the previous few months, even if you combine the usage of the two versions. Evolved Cannon rose to become the most used evolution and building, while at the same time base Cannon had decent usage, meaning combined, it was still being used in more than 1/4 of Grand Challenge decks. You were seeing Evolved Cannon in some minor cycle and graveyard decks, while you were seeing base Cannon used in bait decks, while seeing both versions used in the infamous Archer Queen Royal Hog cycle deck. Cannon was being seen in plenty of new decks that didn't even have a champion in it. The evolution was the most used evolution in Grand Challenges and vastly outshining all of the other defensive buildings, so in March they would give the card a nerf. On March 4th, they increased the Cannon's hit speed by 1/10 of a second. A small but straightforward nerf. But although the base Cannon had a major fallout following this nerf, the evolved Cannon stood strong. It was still consistently one of the, if not the most used evolution. You still saw it in Logbait, but you were also seeing it with Little Prince, Goblinstein, and in April they added a new card, the Boss Bandit, which was yet another very strong champion, so you undoubtedly saw Cannon a lot with it. What they had done was still clearly not enough, so it received yet another nerf in May. In this set of changes, they decreased the barrage radius of the evolved Cannon's projectiles from 2.5 to 2 tiles. This meant you had to be more precise when placing the evolved Cannon. This would make the card more skillful to play in general, which was a major complaint of the evolution before. I'm sure they didn't want to touch the damage because before its damage buff it was practically unseen, so this was a good way to go. Following this change going live, evolved Cannon had a small fall and base Cannon seemed to stay about the same, but it was apparent fairly quickly that it was still decent and would continue to appear about an average amount in competitive areas of the game. And that brings us to September. On September 30th, 2025, champions would be reworked to no longer be out of the player's cycle when on the battlefield, meaning 3-card cycle was gone. 3-card cycle being introduced is a huge part of what brought Cannon back and allowed it to thrive so much, so it just being removed was a bit concerning for Cannon. However, looking at the performance of the evolved Cannon, this removal didn't even seem to make a dent. It had caused a major upsurge originally, but the card had clearly adapted over the years to not have to rely on this broken mechanic for relevancy. Especially with the evolution, it provided a whole new function. However, this wouldn't be the end of it. Since it had been remaining as a top evolution so consistently, Supercell decided to give it yet another nerf. On October 7th, just a week after 3-card cycle's removal, evolved Cannon's barrage damage would be decreased by a whopping 14%, which meant now it actually dealt less damage than it did upon release. Which was crazy because evolved Cannon on release was not popular whatsoever, and you have to keep in mind the barrage radius and hit speed were still nerfed, so the card was overall in a much worse state when looking solely at its stats. But even with evolved Cannon in its weakest state yet, it still maintained decent usage after the changes went live. It had been almost a year since evolved Cannon was released by this point, and the overall power level of evolutions had significantly gone down, so it had to be knocked down another peg to be consistent. Since this change, not only has evolved Cannon remained viable, but it's continually been one of the most used evolutions and buildings in top ladder. And even the base Cannon has been seeing some use. At this point, it just seems like the card can't be stopped. To this day, Cannon is still one of the best buildings in Clash Royale. It's had a crazy journey, but ultimately settled in a great spot. From being bottom of the barrel to a one-deck wonder to the best choice for defense, it's about as basic as you can get when it comes to your defensive building choice, but it's solid. Its cheap cost and evolution has helped it stay relevant and thrive in new decks. Plus, it's had the benefit of being one of the few buildings to even have an evolution. When cards closer to its niche like Bomb Tower or Tombstone get their evolutions, we may start to see it trickle down. Regardless though, I feel like we don't see anyone really talking about Cannon anymore. And to be honest, it's never really been talked about too much from what I've seen. It's mainly just been known as that really annoying card in Hog 2.6 and not much else, and that's partially why I wanted to make a video on it. It's had an incredible journey and allowed for some crazy fast decks to be viable, but when people look back at those decks, Cannon's role is largely underestimated. It got its evolution, and it may receive a small buff or nerf from time to time in the coming years to adjust with the changing environment, but I don't see it dying out or ruling the game in the near future. But hey, anything's possible with Supercell. Anyway though, let me know what you think about the Cannon and if you think it needs any more changes. Also let me know which card's history you would like to see next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.